Tell me a little bit, Si, about your upbringing, because I think you were actually raised in a Marxist household, which not everyone can say is true of their story. What was that like? What were the influences of your parents and so on?
Well, I usually think of my parents as something I call ideological atheists, as opposed
Hmm.
to atheists who just say, well, I don't have enough evidence to believe in God. No, my parents were ideologically convinced, mostly through Marxism. They were members of the American Communist Party, which is fairly rare, but that was in the 30s. And they were committed to the idea that there is no God, cannot be a God, and religion is evil. Christianity was responsible for most of the evil. It was a tool of oppression by the ruling classes. These are all standard Marxist ideologies. So that's how I grew up. I read Soviet published books translated to English for children, and many of them were anti-religion, anti-God. So I just assumed that that was the case. I didn't have many experiences of religion. We didn't celebrate Christmas or any of the holidays. We gave presents on New Year's Day because that was the Soviet tradition. And, that lasted pretty well into my youth, into my early adulthood. I did feel there was something missing in my life, which I now know is a sense of spirituality. But at the time, I was able to fill that gap, at least I felt that way, with science, because I began studying science in college, chemistry at first, and then in graduate school, I went to biochemistry, got my PhD in that. And I found that very fulfilling, just wonderful. I loved science. I mean, science has a spiritual quality in that it seems to relate to truth that's somewhat beyond what we know, what we can see immediately. And so I really liked that. The problem was that I started running into conflicts with my worldview, which was that when I learned about quantum mechanics by studying chemistry, that didn't quite make sense with the materialistic reductionist view that I had of science, of the world.
That's very interesting to hear you say that, because you might assume the opposite, given the way that obviously the new atheist scientists have constantly talked about the way atheism and science fit together perfectly, materialism and so on. What on earth was it that made the science you were encountering actually a challenge to your sort of atheistic materialist sort of worldview?
Well, you're right that is the dominant view among atheists, is that, they'll say, well, I don't believe in God, I believe in science, which to me is, and that's the subject of my second book, is just absurd. It's nonsense. It's like saying, I don't believe in goats, I believe in sheep. I mean, what sense does that make? So what happened was that, the science that I had thought I knew, and of course, that's what we're taught in high school, at least in the 60s and 50s and 60s, was very materialistic. And, the idea was that everything is easily explained by a group of equations, and, there are no mysteries. There's some things we don't know, but we'll eventually solve them using the same methods. But the problem is that when I learned quantum mechanics, and especially things like, the uncertainty principle, it said, no, there are things we can't know. We'll never know the position and momentum of an electron at the same time. We can't. And there's a lot of probability rather than certainty in the Schrodinger equation. So this didn't quite jive with that. It was more of a philosophical thing that I had. I just was kind of worried about it. But when I started studying the details of biochemistry, for example, how proteins are made, I just felt chills going up and down my spine, literally. I just thought, this is unbelievable. How did this happen? How do we have such an incredibly complicated, beautiful system in every cell of our body? And I had no idea what the answer. I knew there was an answer. I thought it was probably evolution was doing it, because, certainly evolution does a lot of things. But still, it raised in me questions about how can we really answer all these questions that are coming up from science itself? And I didn't know the answer. And that did not lead me to theism, to believing in God. I don't think it ever came up in my brain. But what it did do was kind of break down this certainty that science, as you just said, that science is the answer to everything.